Hello, good evening everybody. My name is Peter Wainwright. I'm your host for this evening's webinar on responsible financial management. We finish at 8 o'clock, and I'm joined by three very expert and distinguished panelists from across a range of sectors, and I'll be asking them to introduce themselves very quickly. Just a little bit about the mechanics of this webinar. You can see down in the bottom right-hand corner we have a participant chat. So if you are free to post any questions or comments as we go along. It's for the participants, it's a chat only. You're not able to speak. So the only voices you'll be hearing will be mine and my fellow panelists. Please note this webinar is going to be recorded and to be publicly available. So just to let you know about that. I've been asked to mention a fantastic piece of news before we start. I heard the other day, my email popped up a message to say that the Open University Business School has now been ranked as 13th of the online MBA providers by the Financial Times survey. So that's a tremendous achievement, considering there are 8,000 business schools in the world, and many of them do online. So well done to everybody involved. So what I'd like to do is just ask each panelist in turn just to say a little bit about themselves. Over to you, Dev.
Thank you, Peter. Good evening to all of you. My name is Devendra Kodwani, and currently I am the Associate Dean for Learning and Teaching at the Open University Business School. My academic responsibilities include being part of the MBA program in past, and I've been teaching on the financial strategy modules as part of MBA program. And I played some part in redevelopment of the new MBA as well. So looking forward to conversing with you this evening on an important issue.
Thank you very much, Dev. And over to Tony Nutt, please.
Hello, good evening, everybody. My name is Tony Nutt. I've recently retired as an investment manager from the City of London, where I spent the best part of 35 years with a leading fund management company, an investment bank, and earlier on a retail bank.
Thank you very much, Tony. And finally, John.
Good evening, everybody. My name is John Thompson, and I'm Managing Director of Trans Capital Associates. We provide strategic and financial support predominantly to the SME owner-manager sector, and this business has been driven out of my 30 years of business experience running and managing businesses for myself.
Well, thank you very much. And just about me, I am an alumni from the Open University Business School, and I am also an associate lecturer on a couple of courses with the business school. And also run my own consultancy looking at creativity and innovation across the whole breadth of a company. Now, if you look at the top right-hand corner, you can click on and see our biography. So if you wanted to get in touch with our panelists, I'm sure there's an easy way to do that. So there's more detail about them there. So just to let you know, we've got Andrew. I'll be calling out the name Andrew every now and then. He's our Workcast technical manager, and he's going to be advancing the slides, etc., and controlling the webinar. So what I'd like Andrew to do is to roll on the next slide where we talk about the objectives, please. Okay, Deb in a minute is going to be talking to us about the event in London. But this webinar really is the first time we've done this, where we've taken some edits from that face-to-face event in London. We're going to be sharing some of the thoughts of those experts around the table in video clips, and we're going to be having polls. But the key thing is for you to gain some insights about your own financial management practice in your organizations, at whatever level you're at. So even if you haven't got full responsibility for it, maybe it might give you some ideas as how you can engage in your organization. How can you hold your leaders to account, for example? So we'll now move on to the next slide, which just outlines the agenda, please. Okay, so we're on item 1 now, and if anybody's got any queries about the webinar system technically, put them in the chat. I'll be handing over to Dev shortly. You can then see we've got 4 segments. In each one we play a short video clip of a few minutes, and we launch a poll and have some discussion. And we do that 4 times round, and then that'll take us nicely up towards 8 o'clock. So, Dev, you were at this event in London. Could you tell us a bit about the event? And Andrew, if you could advance us to the next slide, we can see who all the attendees were at that session.
Yes, thank you, Peter. You can see on the slide who the colleagues were at London Thought Leaders Roundtable Conference on 20th of February. I want to talk about a few things about this event that we organized. We've seen since 2007-8 the consequences of financial crisis that began in the financial services industry and spread right across the economies globally. And we have been debating in the academics all these issues in academic journals. But we thought it was important that the practitioners also engage with these issues at a serious level. And we thought bringing together thought leaders who have actually practiced in the City of London and other places as business practitioners who also have perspectives on these issues beyond those of just informed by headlines and newspaper, but have lived and seen through consequences, managed the consequences of the financial crisis. We thought it would be a great idea to bring them together and give us their views. So we organized this event with a view to solicit the opinions and the expert advice of several colleagues, as you see listed there on the slide. And we joined them as academics, bringing some perspective from the academic research. The idea was that through these recorded video conversations, we'll be able to instigate the interest and conversation among the practitioners and the professional managers about the seriousness of the responsible management, about the seriousness of the management of risk within the firms, because the consequences go much beyond just the affected firm. They affect the society, they affect the confidence of investors, and they affect the confidence of employees. So considering the wider implications of this issue, we thought it would be good to bring them in front of you as our esteemed alumni, our current students, and also benefit from some of these conversations and indeed participate and contribute to this debate, and that's the reason we are recording as well. We think as a responsible business management educational institute, we should be doing more than just alerting our students, our alumni to these issues, but allowing them to participate and make their voice heard in appropriate way, and most importantly, create opportunity for them to internalize and challenge, if they wish to, some of these perceptions about why this happened and how it could be managed, and change their practice where necessary. So we very much hope that this type of business perspectives webinar would trigger much more discussion among yourselves in the alumni area, and it won't just stop here, and hopefully it will touch some of you in the detail that some of the practices will be influenced in your professional life. So that was the overall purpose of this Thought Leaders Roundtable conversation that we had in London on 20th of February, and taking it forward today. Thank you.
Dev, thank you very much. I would love to have been there. It sounds like a really rich mix of people, a rare opportunity to have such a wide range of experts talking about items that are never out of the news. Every single day there is something in the news about financial conduct, governance, ethics, and so on. So what I'm going to do is ask Andrew in a second to advance to video 1. This is a short video. As you watch it, it's about regulation. It's about thinking about whose responsibility is it. Why don't you type your experiences? Have you had good experiences of regulation? But who do you think is responsible for tightening it up? So we'll play that, then we'll launch a poll, and the panel will respond to the questions and comments coming through on the chat. So let's have video 1, please.
What is the role of the capital markets? Are we there should we judge everything? Should we have a regulatory regime which means that everything has to be in place and it has to be perfect? Or, as you've already said, it's an uncertain world where things change. And at the time when we start, and when businesses start out, and when they go to IPO, we think they look okay, but looking back, we realise they're not okay. And then what we do is we say, who can we blame? So 2008 onwards has been about, it's like living in my house. It's when everything goes wrong, it's who do we blame? And I think we can never really, ever create a financial system in a quasi-capitalist way which we've got everything covered. I think we've covered a number of things in terms of responsibility and culture. I think they're very, very important, but Barclays Bank has shown it's very, very difficult to actually change culture overnight. I worked for RBS, and I could see how cultural changes when I was working for ABN AMRO when it was taken over by RBS. There was a cultural shift. But where do we judge that? Where do we change that? Do we put a regulatory regime in place? Do we have the FCA to say, you have to change your culture? Is that from the shareholders? Is it from the company? Is it from the government? Is it from the regulatory regime? And I think we still, even though we've come 5 years post-financial crisis, we still haven't actually addressed those issues, and they're still as important today as they were 5 years ago. And of course, there'll be more books written this time. It's different because we always think it is different, and then we go 5 years and the IPO market picks up again, and everyone goes back to their old trick. So I would say, to throw open, what do we do to change? How can we regulate? I know this is not about regulation, but this is how do we put in place a financial system which at least has 80 to 90% of the correct characteristics.
Let me say this, because there is no shortage of academic research out there which into company failures. And I know in particular of one large sovereign wealth fund that did research, and the only common factor they could find in terms of corporate failures was hubris. And I think this whole issue of regulation at the present time is misunderstood. If you look at examples within the UK, such as Northern Rock's a good example, but there are a number. There may be the mining sector. I would still argue companies like Boomi, for instance. If regulation had been appropriate, and perhaps a better way of describing it, if the political appetite was there to apply the correct level of regulation, then these things could have been avoided. It isn't difficult as an institutional shareholder, where you sit around with company managers at chairman's, chief executive, CFO level every day of your life to identify where hubris exists. Okay, that really isn't that difficult to do. And it is the responsibility of the board and the non-executive directors to ensure that the executive directors have clear focus on what their corporate governance should be at a given point in time. And it is only when the politicians fail to recognise, and believe you me, in the case of some of the banks in the UK, the institutional shareholders, the stockbroking fraternity recognised long before, Dr. Peter Warburton wrote a book, The Debt and Delusion, long before the financial crisis. People can identify and can recognise that certain companies are going to fail if the model depends wholly upon wholesale funding, forgive the jargon, but depending not purely on deposits to finance the growth of the business and the loans going forward. So, I do believe that the level of regulation has been inappropriate, and that going forward you can apply regulation. But the issue about globalisation is you have to convince other countries to do it. You have to convince Nigeria to do it, you have to convince China to do it, and you have to convince the US to do it.
Well, that's a very interesting video segment about the challenges of improving regulation. We've now got poll 1 that's up, and it's going to stay up for a couple of minutes. And while you are voting for that on that poll, you can see the screen up there now. I'm just going to go to Tony. Tony, do you think we're actually having more luck these days in an international context in trying to get cooperation amongst sort of governments to improve regulation, or are we still not really making much progress?
I don't think I would use the word luck. The intent is there, but the interested parties at this point in time have not really come together in a manner that is required if, from a global point of view, we are to have some uniform regulation. Maybe that doesn't answer your question very well. What I'm trying to get at here is that we're moving along the right path, but we're certainly not there yet to avoid some of the obvious errors that we've made in the past.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it sounds like it takes a lot of time. John, from your background, have you seen situations where companies have fallen foul of regulation and actually perhaps they ought to do an awful lot more themselves rather than waiting for external regulation, that actually their own kind of behaviour isn't up to scratch?
Yes, thank you. That's exactly the point that I would make on this, is that you can have all the regulation in the world, and it seems we did post-2008, but ultimately it comes down to the individuals involved driving the business, and it's a big truism is that behaviours get driven down from the top, and if the person or the team that are leading a business or a division have a different set of agendas and drivers than that of the regulators, then that's what I often see in those companies, that the behaviours are driven not by the regulator but by the individuals leading the business. Okay.
Well, let's see. Thanks. Let's see what our poll comes up with. So, Anthony, can we close the poll and we'll hopefully get the results, and we'll have time for just a couple of minutes a comment from our panel. And I can see some comments coming through on the participant chat. We may be able to pick up some of those. So let's have a look. That's really interesting. So the D, focus on improving behaviours, gets 41%. And let me just ask Dev for a quick comment. I mean, what's your reflection on these poll results? Is this something that you would have expected?
Yes, I would have. Actually, it also relates to one of the comments in chat area from someone who talks about Alan Greenspan's comment that part of the problem is human nature. And we do see, and this is where we want to play our role as a responsible educational institution, that if it is about changing individual behavior, what is it that we can do as an educational institute? I would sympathize with that, because yes, part of the problem was bad regulation. But then there is the other side of the coin, which was that firms were doing what they were doing, and firms are nothing but collection of individuals and groups. So obviously there was something not right about that conduct, and therefore the central issue turns out to be how we conduct ourselves as responsible managers or responsible executives. So that relates to the individual, and I feel sympathetic to that. I may also pick up something on the regulation comment there, Peter, if I may.
Yes.
It was said by Neil Ferguson, and it's coming up here again on the screen about regulation, that it was bad regulation. But, this lobbying and the public nature of the regulation, we have seen the consequences in UK. For example, Financial Services Authority was disbanded. It has been replaced with a couple of new regulatory agencies by the government, which is Financial Conduct Authority and some other. The name escapes me. So if there's a public body under criticism, something can be done, because they don't have that much of lobbying power as we have seen some of the private companies which seem to have lobbied against serious restructuring of the banking business, for example. So there are issues of organized lobbying affecting sometimes the choices that we as societies make, and balance. And this goes back to the point that Tony made earlier on. What's the political will? To what extent is the political will strong enough to effect the change on so far as regulation is concerned?
Okay, well, thanks very much indeed for that, Dev. We're going to move on to our next video in a second. It does seem from the comments that there's a complex interaction between all these various factors, and we need to perhaps look at it in a systemic way. So let's move on to our next video. It continues the theme of the people in this whole business about financial management, and it's about leadership and responsibility. So runs for about 4 minutes, and again, type away your comments as ideas come to mind.
Culture is something an organisation has. It has either momentum or inertia, depending on whether it's positive or negative. The leadership have some levers they can pull, but they can't actually make a culture do exactly what they want it to do. It's an evolving thing that comes out of the actions they take. And I think the thing that really I like about looking at organisations from both the big ones and the small ones is if you have a very large organisation which is only performing averagely, you could argue the leadership is immaterial. It's probably a bit provocative. But most of the business in the organisation is taking in the middle layers. The people who sit in front of customers, the people who sign contracts, the people who set up engineering studies, the business is being done in the middle. If that business is not trying to move itself to an outlier position, what is the leadership doing? In which case, if it's only performing averagely and doing so over time, the leadership is immaterial.
There's clearly an idea that companies have enterprise throughout. There's a lot of talk that it's not really just necessarily down to the leader, and actually the leader maybe needs to be the safer pair of hands, the helicopter view. I think going back to responsibility, though, you talk about leaders, and an interesting point about it's the non-execs that maybe have been the moral guardians. I'd question that now going forward. You know, the more as people like me read about whether it be Goodwin or Anthony Jenkins or the guy from Capita who was all over the papers during the Olympics run-up, these are leaders who can no longer hide behind the board or the non-execs. They're front there. They're transparent in lots of sectors. And as technology opens them up more and more, do they need to show much more responsibility? And how does that pervade through the company? And I think we can discuss that for the last few minutes before we break.
To me, there's the first one was that I came across was we had a very good non-exec on one board who really wasn't doing very much for the company. And I said, how do you get this non-exec performance? I was talking to the chairman and said, can he get around the business? And he basically said, no, we don't encourage that sort of thing around here. Financially, he was an FTSE 100 chairman. So that was the first thing. I think the second thing, which is key about governance, under the code, the external evaluation is commissioned effectively by the company secretary and the chairman. It's managed by the company secretary and the chairman. So even if you uncover risky behaviour within the organisation, it very rarely gets even beyond the chairman and the co-sec into the board itself, let alone to any key shareholders. In fact, I've even talked to shareholders who have blocked shares, and they sometimes don't want to know because then they'd have to make a decision, and then they could be seen to be interfering with the company. And if there's another 500,000 shareholders, minority shareholders, have they had an unfair influence on the company? So all of those complex issues came into this whole governance thing when you do an external board evaluation. It's closed. I don't think it has real value still. And until that opens up a bit, it's going to do.
I think there's an interesting debate in that about how close companies can be. I think in the past, yes, you can almost keep it within the company, but now somebody in a mid-management position who could be sourcing a supplier that might be sourcing their materials unethically, that can suddenly jump not to the board, not to the gateway to the board. It could jump straight out here to Twitter, It can straight into the wider world. And we've seen that with lots of organisations who suddenly are having the risky behaviour suddenly exposed and their risks suddenly become very clear. And actually the decision being taken by CEOs then within 24 hours to do something about it without a board meeting.
The one thing that has changed since the last financial crisis is the whole area of whistleblowing. Indeed, in some European countries, whistleblowing, as you'll know, was illegal at one point in time. Now, it's compulsory, for want of a better phrase. The onus is on you when it comes to issues like money laundering and whatever. You have to speak out. And that has certainly tightened up. So, that would be one good example of what has come out of the financial crisis.
there's some interesting clips there about leadership and perhaps our own behaviours. So what we've got now is poll 2. I'll read the questions because there was a comment there saying that we had it for too short a time. So the questions here is about what can you do to improve openness and accountability in your organisation. Is it about improving the effectiveness of your whistleblowing processes so that problems can be aired at all levels of the organisation? Is it actually about strengthening the role of the non-executive directors? Should you be actually influencing your shareholders to taking more responsibility alongside their concerns about financial returns? Or really, is it about going back to the theme of leadership, improving the quality of leadership at all levels? So if we could launch the poll, Andrew, for people to vote, and I will just, if I may, cue in John to address some of these things. John, looking at this in an international kind of context, do you think there's a sort of an international or a cultural difference across different countries? Do you think in the so-called Anglo-Saxon model in the West, the US, UK, some parts of Europe, that we're too focused on the financial returns and we don't worry too much about the leadership aspect, and perhaps those are taken more seriously in other parts of the world?
Yes, I do think that is the case. It's recognised, I think, throughout the world that we here in this part of the world are focused on short-term results, and of course then that will itself influence the leader of an organisation. Just a point I wanted to make on that, just going back to that last clip and talking about the leader and the responsibility that they take, and that they should potentially be a safe pair of hands, taking a holistic view of the organisation and leading it forward. That everyone in the organisation, from my experience, is a leader in different ways, and those behaviours that we're talking about can be driven by everybody throughout the organisation. It's not just down to the person who's at the absolute top of the organisation. So in answer to your first question, yes, I do think that there are different views on these matters internationally, and that we are very short-termist here, but that can often work against us in terms of the agenda that our leaders throughout an organisation might have.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that, John. I'll ask Andrew to close the poll, because I want to see how our panellists, I'll ask Dev to respond in a second to the poll results. So, wow, even more one answer dominating the other. So improving the quality of leadership at all levels. Dev, do you see that this is actually happening from your experience?
I would say it's qualified no,
right.
No, Peter, because what happens at the organizational level is people first find systems faults or structural faults and start fixing those. And I think that's one of the reasons that we have ended with the compliance culture, which we touch upon later on in one of the clips. And the response has been mostly external rather than the internal. So while it's perceived, our response is in the right direction, because we know that any significant change in the conduct of responsible business has to be from inside the firm. So externally you can only do very little in a privately owned companies. So I'm not surprised by the poll results, which seems to be a legitimate wish of most right-thinking people. But to achieve that improvement in the quality of leadership at all levels internally is a far bigger challenge, as you would know from practice and colleagues around the table would know, than to be able to say, okay, we have improved the systems and we'll comply with the reporting and so on. So unfortunately, it is not that there is perhaps lack of willingness, it is probably because it is difficult to do that this response doesn't resonate with the reality.
That's really interesting. I mean, it does raise the question of how we get leadership improved in the sort of in the sort of finance profession in general, and people with particular responsibilities at kind of board level. But one thing I found quite interesting is that A, B, and C get very similar votes, and it's nice to see that whistleblowing is
yes,
on the increase, I hope, and that people favouring it. So. Well, look, looking at my clock, I noticed that we've got to move on to the next video segment. So thanks for all your comments, folks. Keep them rolling in on the chat. And the next segment is looking at this issue of behaviour versus compliance and performance and these sort of subtle relationships. So let's roll the next video, and then that'll be we'll have another poll after that.
Some of the research that we've done shows that even when you have high compliance index, because one way to measure the effect of corporate governance on the risk or the cost of capital is to see whether compliance leads to better governance or better performance of the companies, and the relationship is somewhat weak actually, what we find most of the time, and that is now being corroborated on this table roundabout, that what you're saying is the behavior need not translate into compliance, and compliance need not translate into good or bad behavior. So I think the difficulty with regulation, whether it is combined code or Sarbanes-Oxley, is that assumption that if you somehow make companies comply with the regulation, the behavior would change. It need not. I mean, now we are going to the second layer of analysis in German companies, where we are saying, which is UK, I think, a comply or explain system. So when they don't comply, they put some explanations forward, and that is more common in German companies, we find, than in UK companies. And when you look at that explanation of non-complying with certain standards, they are playing the games of highest order. For 3-4 years, same statement is repeated, then they tweak the statement a little bit after 4 years. But actual change within the company is not happening. So they're playing with words even when they're putting explanation forward. So explanations, so now we're looking at the quality of explanation of not complying. But I don't think it still allows us to see why they would change or why they would not change the behavior, because they are different. They have two-tier system, as we know, supervisory board and executive board. And so it throws up different challenge. But bigger question is, you can have a sound corporate governance system in place, and we are looking at this now in African continent, in Kenya, and find the same problem. On paper, high compliance within banks, but Kenya has in last few years large number of bank failures. Although on paper you would say they have similar to combined code as UK has. High compliance index, so I could tick 90% standards met on the complying with regulatory requirement. The performance doesn't change. So we are finding very weak relationship between the compliance and the performance, and that perhaps is explained by the difference between compliance and behavior.
Well, that's a very interesting clip because we may have regulations that require organizations and companies to comply, but what happens if they don't? So that's what poll 3 is looking at. So I'll just read out the questions, and then I'll ask our panel to comment. So what can you do to improve the effectiveness of compliance in your organization? Is it actually about lobbying to improve the quality of the statutory reporting of non-compliance in the countries you operate in? Should you be lobbying to change the law? Should you be actually improving the quality of explanation of any non-compliance? Never mind what the law says. Should you be actually giving a fuller explanation and being more open or honest, perhaps? Or is it C? Should we actually be having evidence of leadership and behaviour change in our formal compliance systems? If by what we've been saying earlier, there's a strong element of behaviour and culture. Or is it D, that actually you should develop compliance systems in yourself and perhaps, by implication in your partner organisations that actually exceed the statutory requirements? So please vote for A, B, C or D. Dev, let me ask you, it was very interesting, you mentioned about some banks, I think, in Africa who were still not having difficulty with complying. What do you think needs to be done to improve that, and particularly perhaps the explanation of compliance, of non-compliance?
Well, Peter, what we are arguing actually is that there is no one-size-fits-all compliance or regulatory governance regulatory system that meets the needs of globally diverse communities. So, for example, in Africa, if you try to transplant, as has been done, a UK or OECD compliance code or governance code without looking at the institutional and social factors in those societies, then the fit won't be with the local context, and therefore it renders the a tool that perhaps works in West to some extent ineffective in a different context. So one thing we have to bear in mind that how companies are governed and how oversight is exercised by the external stakeholders depends on the context, which is the local, cultural, social, political context. So that's one thing which one needs to bear in mind. And to make it work, I think it has to be more like the UK system. It has its own merits and faults, but the thing is, at least in UK, you are saying comply, or if you don't, then explain, rather than putting massive regulatory cost on all the companies, irrespective of the size of those companies or the complexities of those companies, because that's what the US system does. It is what is called rules-based regulatory system, which imposes a blind cost on everyone who is an incorporated entity and listed. So perhaps what we need is more vigilant institutional investors. Somebody mentioned in the chat area about the role of large investors. We know in most companies the share ownership has become concentrated rather than very distributed. So it's the role of responsible institutional investors which I think is important in bringing about some responsible behavior.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much for that, Dev. Andrew, could we have the poll results, please? And then when they come up, I'll ask Tony to comment. So let's just see if we are surprised by poll 3 results. So, Tony, we've got 46% number C, followed by D at 34%. So, from your experience, Tony, what's your take on these poll results?
To my mind, it's interesting that, let me just get this right, C and D, include evidence of leadership and behaviour change. The issue, what I would say about this is much of this is about definition. What do we mean by compliance? And I would urge everyone in considering all these issues, whether it be good leadership, whether it be compliance, whether it be regulation, what do we mean by all this? And what are the consequences of getting it wrong? And it would seem to me, in an effort to answer your question, if you get these things wrong, having decided what the definition of regulation or good leadership should be, the consequences are that the risk in any commercial unit, any business, rises rapidly. And what we're trying to do is to limit that risk as much as possible. That is not to take out entrepreneurship or reduce it. It's just to have a more effective method of complying with the reduction of risk, for want of a better phrase, within a business. And all of these answers, A, B, C, and D, I think are useful. But if you get your compliance systems wrong, then you're not going to be able to identify what the inherent risks may be, whether they're leadership, regulatory, whatever they may be. So it would seem to me quite sensible that C comes out strongly here.
Okay, that's really really interesting. There's a question here about shared ownership of the design of compliance systems, which I thought was really really interesting. And I suspect there may be some differences across different kind of business models. We've got a little bit of time, so perhaps I'll ask John, what do you think? I mean, D came out very strongly. I know, obviously, organisations can improve their compliance systems. Have you come across examples of organisations that have actually done that, have really stepped up in the last few years to say, let's have a stronger set of rules that we follow?
Well, I have actually, yes. There's an organisation called the Asset-Based Finance Association, and they have relatively recently introduced some fairly stringent regulations themselves. So this is not statutory regulation, this is their own regulation. And it would be nice to think that they've done that with all good intentions, and I think mostly it is. But the other point that's worth mentioning there is that I think that part of that decision has been made to avoid having stringent regulation hoisted upon them. Again, there are two agendas, as I find there very often are, and as has been said earlier by Deb.
Very interesting. I mean, and certainly by looking at the chat, there do seem to be sort of tensions. It's not all, it may seem, some of these things may seem obvious to do, but a point here about developing compliance systems may make you perhaps less competitive in a way. So anybody who wants to type away in the chat on that, that'd be fantastic. Okay, well, let's move on to our next video is about kind of preparing for a crisis, and we hear some words about the concept of sort of black swan events, i.e. the events that are very, very rare and most unexpected. But it links back to the 2008 thinking about, was the world prepared for this crisis? Could we have actually foreseen it? So bearing in mind that we are going to get financial shocks, look at this clip and see what you think. So, Andrew, if we could roll the next clip, please.
This is a short scenario, but very much realistic. We know Queen asked this famous question after the financial crisis that if these things were so large, how come everyone missed them? And we know that there was, I think, 50-odd economists and business experts did respond to Queen's question, which appeared in a British Academy on the website. But I want to raise that question here again, but it's with slightly different take on it, that how did many companies respond to what happened? So we know many auto companies responded by making adjustments to their capacity of production, by reducing the working hours, by reducing the staff, by stopping production for a while in some cases. So the question is in two parts. How do they respond in the aftermath of such a catastrophic event? And can they really be prepared? Anyone who is prepared with thoughts could start.
In reality, we're being asked to forecast the unforecastable, and so how we deal with that. The issue is that in facing companies is, on the one hand, they're being asked to have an efficient balance sheet and have their business in place, which is taking a longer-term view, looking very efficient as of today, but simultaneously incorporating high risk and probability analysis in their outlook. So it's always it's a problem between short term and long term, and ultimately it's always going to come down to flexibility. What we saw, companies that went through the financial crisis and came out relatively unscathed were probably the most flexible in terms of, not just in terms of hiring or firing, but in terms of how they've structured, how they are financially structured.
I think my response is it possible to be non-reactive, that you're ahead of the curve? In other industries which I've worked in, where there have been seismic crashes, the telecoms industry for one, trying to do a business in Asia in 1997, oil price crash in 1985-86, almost unforeseeable. But if you're on the inside of your industry and you're measuring the right things and doing the right things, you should be able to get ahead of the curve. So my question really is, for people who are on the inside of the financial world, there must have been people who knew roughly what was going, and was it because it was such a big seismic shock on the way that nobody could fix it? Or was it just that, well, we know it's going to happen, let's make as much money as we can before the whole house of cards comes down? And I have specific examples of businesses in engineering and manufacturing who have seen things coming a couple of years in advance. The telecoms meltdown is one of those, where they immediately switch that strategy well ahead of the herd and come out as the strongest player in the pack at the end and mop up as a consolidator.
And when do you take action? So, there's an example here with a lot of car companies. are you going to start to ramp down your manufacturing in the anticipation of something coming along? But you may lose a year's worth of revenue, which is not good for the business. So I think there's calling the timing is harder than saying that something is going to happen. I think then, in terms of how to respond to it, it's been said before about flexibility. I think that's absolutely key, not only in terms of operationally, but also in terms of the way that the business is funded. Because the ones that seem to have gone really pear-shaped are the ones that were really saddled with debt and highly leveraged, and therefore by not having those levels of debt, which is difficult to service in the bad times, gives them puts them in a better position. And I think finally, there's a question mark around: do you diversify as well from a revenue point of view, in order to spread some of the risk, or should you be? I work with a lot of businesses who focus and become real niche specialists in their industry. And again, there's some strategic choices I think that people need to make, or organisations need to make, as to which is the best route to go down.
Yeah.
Okay.
The good thing that I see of the way that we came out of this massive financial crisis is that there were so many lessons learnt from previous recessions and hits to the economy. Particularly, we've spoken about people and the importance of people to organisations, and how it seems that we learnt that we must keep our good people, keep the knowledge. Maybe we reduce hours, maybe we reduce a little bit of headcount, but we keep the knowledge, and I think we've done that really, really well. And the casualties, as we've all said, have been those businesses that have very high fixed costs, lack flexibility, and have an incredibly leveraged balance sheet.
I think the crisis happened because, whether it be in the field of consumer finance or corporate and industrial finance, that there was a willingness on both sides of the fence, either providers of capital and the receivers of capital, to take on an amount of debt that was almost unprecedented. So all the jargon relating to issues such as covenant light, structured products, private equity, buying companies on 6-7 times turnover, it was just an acceptance that we felt we were so sophisticated to understand these products, and quite honestly the consumer wasn't sophisticated enough, and neither was the commercial sector. And like a pack of cards, the inevitable happened. Now, companies nowadays have sophisticated, or should have sophisticated, risk registers. They should have a list of risks that they identify, know whether they're high, low or medium risks, and how they should respond to those. And that should be the case whether it's a manufacturing company or a commercial or financial company. They should have living wills, arguably, as they do in the financial sector. What happens if time is called on the company? It has to wind up. What have you got left?
Yes, but most organisations now do have a risk analyst, but I did some research a couple of years ago, and the sad fact of that is that the majority don't often get in front of the board. So while there is a risk analyst going on, there's a risk. The board is oblivious is too strong a word, but it doesn't get to board level as often as it might. I think that's important.
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, people will be debating the financial crash for a long time to come. But this leads us on to what the poll here is talking about. And what I'd like to do in the chat for our final sort of discussion is to have some discussions about what can you do personally in your organisation to make a difference. So the question here is, how should your organisation, you as a manager, your organisation, better prepare for unexpected events? Should you really be treating financial risks in a more integrated way with the other business risks and not treating them as separate? Should you be giving more attention to the whole process of risk assessment and management at much higher levels, at a strategic level or board-level discussions? Do you actually need to have corporate financial strategies that are just more resilient to external events, and that implies some effort of forecasting and perhaps scenario planning? Or D, an interesting one, should we actually learn from the way other organizations use techniques to prepare for this, perhaps ones that are completely outside your sector? So let's let the poll run on that, and I'll ask John to come in. In the context of everything we've been hearing about needing to improve behaviours, can we just put that perhaps to one side and say, I mean, have you got examples of organisations that really do take this seriously? They look far ahead, they do some element of scenario planning, financial risk management is fully integrated into top-level decision-making, or is it still a rare thing that we see, John?
I have experience of both situations. Unfortunately, it's still the norm in the sectors that I'm dealing with that they will not go as far as scenario planning. What I encourage people to do on a very regular basis is to constantly review their business model, both in relation to the internal and the external environments within which they're operating, because the surest thing in life is that things don't stay the same, and in our world today things move ever faster, it seems, and just remain flexible. And I think more and more people are getting onto the flexibility issue. Outsourcing is obviously a major factor in many businesses now, just something relatively new as the cloud, which everybody talks about and not everybody understands, but the cloud is a good example of that. Remaining flexible, constantly reviewing the business model, keeping fixed costs to a minimum, another key issue, and having personnel that are as multi-skilled as possible. Is another key issue that I recommend to everybody that I work with in preparation for the black swan or something possibly not quite as bad.
Okay, thanks, John, for that. Yes, earlier you talked about sort of keeping the knowledge in the business, so that's really important, knowledge and kind of multi-skilled approach. Let's see what the poll results are like, please, Andrew. And I'll ask Dev to comment. It's amazing, these results. We seem to be having one question seems to get the majority. Again, this is number C, which is create corporate financial strategies that are more resilient to external events. And then next is B is the most important one, which is the red. Give more attention to the risk assessment process at the higher level, strategic level, board level. Dev, what do you think of these poll results? Do they surprise you, or how does it stack up with your findings and experience in the past?
It does back up what my colleague Professor David Wilson was saying from his research, that he found, although there is risk awareness and assessment done at the junior and middle level, but most of the time those issues don't get enough attention at the strategic level or board level discussion. So I'm not surprised to this preference of so many people responding to this question by choosing option C, but I was actually expecting option A to come up, because that's what usually the textbook answers would be, that treat financial risks as integrated and so on. So I'm glad to see that all our participants have gone beyond textbooks and come back with a more realistic assessment of situation. That means our MBA has been successful in that sense, because we always ask people to challenge what is received wisdom.
Yes.
But on a serious point, that it's very interesting to see this response, because it does highlight, because it comes from the people who are practicing executives themselves, it does suggest that what David found in his research is being corroborated by this poll as well. And I think one of the things about risk management is that a point about retaining knowledge, which the lessons that we learned from past financial crisis and that John referred to. I think it reminds me of the vaccination that we do on bodies, our biological vaccinations. It is kind of introducing mild virus and then telling the body to be prepared for next time around when the enemy is around, so you can quickly prepare the weapon. And this is where I feel scenario planning can be a very powerful tool yes, we know some people in the audience have said if it did not happen, it would not be a crash. If it was predictable, it would not be a crash. But still, you can do something at the practical level by doing near-death scenario analysis. What is it that can kill the organization in 2 years' time or 3 years' time? And those scenario planning exercises bring out the powerful risk identification approaches that can be helpful. It's like I call it, organizational immunization process.
Right. I like that very much. I like that that analogy. Very, very, very timely. So. Yes, making sure that we are in good health and getting inoculated. We just got a couple of minutes left. So what I'm going to do is, if we can move to our final slide, just as for Q&A and summary, and get a couple of concluding thoughts from Tony first, and then John. So Tony, looking at the webinar and perhaps putting it into context of the round table. What do you think are the key points that are coming out for you, or that you've picked up from perhaps the chat or from this evening?
For me, I think it would be how we identify the inherent risks, the systemic risks, and the cyclical risks that emerge in business from time to time. If we can take that on board, and I would say at this point, I disagree with the view that risk doesn't get in front of boards. I believe it does. In my experience, it does. Large UK pharmaceutical company will have 500 people in its risk department.
Right.
Okay? The difficulty is, where the disconnect occurs, is companies tend to respond to short-term performance. In the US and in the UK, we have quarterly numbers to be produced, and management teams tend to think more about the short-term performance. Will they meet stakeholders' expectations, etc., than about keeping a close eye on what could become a cyclical or a systemic risk. So I would argue there are people who identified the last financial crisis, but the fact that no one can say when it will actually occur tends to put such issues on the back burner. So for me, I think businesses do work hard on identifying long-term risks. It's just the timing of it is so very difficult.
Thanks very much. That's really it's a lot of things for us to be reflecting on. Thank you. And John, just briefly from you, please. Is there some concluding thought, please?
Yes, I think it's incredibly pleasing for me to see so much support in the various votes for the behavioural aspects of regulation and the associated risks. And just the recognition of that, I think, is a massive step in the right direction, because I truly believe that you can have every bit of regulation in the world, but people who have differing agendas, and that can be any of the stakeholders, political, suppliers, customers, employees, any of them having the wrong agendas, can absolutely send things the wrong way. So I think if we can lead forward a group of people with the right behaviours, I think that's a massive step in the right direction.
And thank you very much. Another powerful message, I think, for all our audience to take away and chat with their colleagues and their bosses and teams about behaviours. Thank you. And Dev, could I just a brief thought from you about this Business Perspectives webinar? So again, it's the first time, not the first time we tried a webinar, but the first time we've had an entirely online event based on a roundtable discussion of a panel of experts. So what's been the highlight for you?
Peter, for me, highlight has been the participants who had joined us and actively contributed to the serious conversation, as we can see in the participant chat area. That has been fantastic, because I see participants from all around, from Canada, US, we got German, European partners, participants, and so on. So for me, it is very heartening to see that purpose with which we set up this Business Perspectives seminar has been achieved, and already so much nice conversation and meaningful conversation has taken place. I am sure once we put it up on the website, a lot more discussions will take place, and hopefully alumni would benefit and, of course, contribute. What it does show is the power of community learning, for which Open University champions, and we think this business perspective allows us to do that much better. I know we are over time here, Peter, so I want to stop here by just thanking everyone who has joined us from the alumni and current students, and also I want to give big thanks to the panelists who participated in the roundtable discussions in London, as well as John and Anthony have come over here again at Open University to be with us this evening. And none of these complicated online webinars or events can happen without fantastic support that colleagues provide. So don't want to forget Jackie Thomason and Christina Sattif for setting this up, and of course our cost colleague Andrew there. But nonetheless, in the end, I don't want to forget a silent contributor who has been participating in chat area, a guy called Terry O'Sullivan. Now he laughs, but he's my very esteemed dear colleague from the Open University Business School, senior academic in strategy and marketing area, but also he's our conscience keeper. He has been doing a lot of work on making sure that responsibility and ethics are on top of our agenda when we design the curriculum for our students. So thank you, Terry, as well. And by that, I would bring this to a closure, Peter, from my side.
Thank you very much indeed, Dev. We're going to finish within a minute because I'm very well aware that we're over time. So if we could have on the next slide, please, Andrew, just quick details of our next Business Perspectives event, which is taking place in London on the 22nd of May. Hopefully that's on screen now. Yeah,
and
brilliant.
Again, the theme is trust, as you can see, Peter.
Yes.
And I should not end this session without thanking you and your contribution, Peter, for making it.
Thank you.
And, of course, I wanted to mention, although this seminar was about financial risk management, the Open University Business School is launching a specialist master's program in finance, MSc Finance, from October 2014, which is a MSc. And you would see a lot of these discussions about governance and responsible financial practice will be taken up in that qualification as well.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And on the next slide is just details of how you can continue the conversation, details of the website, how to email us, and the various LinkedIn groups, if we could have that coming up. We're learning all the time here how to get better at these webinars, and it's getting slicker each time. So that's how you can get in touch. I'll leave that up. So from me, just to thank you all, thanks ever so much to everybody for contributing, to our panelists and to the Open University Business School for organising this. And do get in touch, and that's a very good night from me. Thank you for coming. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.